Hi, Andrew.
Hey, how are you, Madison?
I'm great. How are you? Thank you so much for joining us.
It's great to be here. You're safe and sound. Where are you physically?
I'm in Tampa, very safe and sound. How are you? How
Hmm.
are you and your family doing?
Well, can't complain at all. Everyone's healthy. The kids are trying to learn by video, like a lot of kids. But we're in an environment in upstate New York where I can just walk outside and go for a stroll if I want. So I really can't complain.
Good. I'm glad to hear that. And I want to give a quick intro to our audience as they're joining us here. My name is Madison. I'm a reporter with Bloomberg News. I'm joined here, of course, by Andrew Yang, entrepreneur and former presidential candidate. Andrew, thank you again for making the time. And for our viewers who are watching, I want to remind you to comment with any questions you have for Andrew. We'll try to ask as many as we can while we have you here. But first, I'd love to start by just, of course, starting by talking about universal basic income. I'm wondering if you can share how COVID-19 has impacted your thoughts on the implementation of UBI.
This is a devastating time for so many Americans, and we just need to put money into people's hands as quickly as possible. So I'm thrilled that today Nancy Pelosi came out and said that we need to consider universal basic income. Dozens of members of Congress are already now saying we need $2,000 a month for everyone during this time. What I've been saying to people, Madison, is that this crisis has in many ways accelerated the rate of change, where we've gone through 10 years of change in the equivalent of 10 weeks or less. And so obviously I thought universal basic income was a good idea even in the absence of this crisis, but it's more urgent than ever. It's literally life or death for far too many Americans right now.
And you mentioned politicians talking about universal basic income, but you really championed the idea of UBI during your candidacy. I'm wondering what it feels like for you to hear, the president talking about the implementation of a program that's so close to your heart.
Well, I'm just glad that they're using their common sense, because it's clear if you have tens of millions of Americans trapped at home with no income, we're going to need to get money into their hands. My frustration is around the fact that the bulk of the stimulus has not gone to families. It's gone to big companies. It's gone to businesses that have private bankers and have those relationships. I mean, we saw the small business payment protection program just run out of money. I have many people telling me that they're calling state unemployment offices and just getting busy signals and never hearing back. So I just wish we were putting more money just directly into people's hands. But it's good that we're at least doing what we are doing. I just wish that we treated our people the same way we treat the biggest companies.
Absolutely. And that brings me to one question we got from an audience member before we went live. They asked if you were in the White House right now, how would you be handling stimulus checks?
Well, the first thing is you shouldn't means test it, because there are many Americans who are in position of desperation right now, but they made a lot of money last year. And I was talking to a restaurateur who looked good on paper, but she is broke because her restaurant obviously shut down, and she was trying to keep her employees from going broke and facing really difficult circumstances. So she was like, why are they not treating me like everyone else, where I really need the $1,200? And she does. And the fact is, we could have just given it to everyone and then just taken it back in next year's tax returns if we felt like it. So there's no reason not to just give it to everyone. The universe of people that are not getting it, unfortunately, in the millions of tens of millions, because a lot of people don't file tax returns, or they don't have auto pay, or there's some issue. So to me, I would be reversing the scales, where instead of the vast majority going to big businesses, I would say the vast majority should be going to people. And I would make it as universal as possible, even beyond certainly any level of income, but even whether or not you filed a tax return. If we can find you, we should be giving you enough money to get by.
And this brings me to some of the programs that you've launched in light of COVID-19. One of them launched today. Can you describe the All Americans movement and your role in that?
So one of the tragic outgrowths of this time is that racism has surged towards different groups, and Asian Americans have felt a new level of fear and anxiety around the fact that people blame us for the virus, even though we were a world away and are just victims like anyone else. So I launched this All Americans campaign today, just saying, look, we're all in this together. all donations and purchases go to COVID relief and the crisis text line to help people with the anxiety and fear that comes with this time. And it's just a really heartbreaking phenomenon that in this crisis, unfortunately, we're seeing Black people die at much higher levels in Michigan and other parts of the country because of pre-existing conditions and lower access to healthcare. But also racism against Asian Americans has surged. You're seeing hundreds of reported assaults around the country. And so I thought I could do something to help.
Of course, and you mentioned on your podcast, which launched today, that the crisis text line you talked about is surging right now. Can you talk about that a bit?
Yeah, I talked to the CEO of the crisis text line, Nancy Lublin, who's awesome. She's a powerhouse. So their traffic has doubled company-wide, and which makes sense because we're all stressed out and anxious, and there are a lot of people suffering. But then the proportion of Asian Americans who've used the crisis text line more than doubled on top of the doubling. It went from 5% of the lower total to 13% of the higher total. And so I heard that and I said, well, that's heartbreaking because you have people who are looking to hurt themselves at much higher levels. We had a mental health crisis before the coronavirus, and now we've compounded the anxiety and stress and isolation. And so the fact that the crisis text line's traffic has doubled probably doesn't surprise anyone listening to this. But we have to think about what the implications are, and to the extent that we can help, we need to do all we can.
And can you talk a little bit more specifically about, if you were in the White House right now, what would you be doing to address the mental health crisis in this country?
Well, the first thing I would do, because you have to control what you can control, Madison. So the first thing I would say is look, you do not need to worry about your material needs, putting food on the table. We're going to distribute money to everyone, and you don't even need to pay your bills. Your credit card company, your landlord, the oil company can just send us, the government, your bill, and we'll pay them for the duration of the crisis. Because the fact is, our bureaucracy is not designed to get us the money to give to all the people that we pay every month. It's highly flawed. It's one reason why everyone's so anxious and pissed off right now. So if the government just said, look, not on you, we'll just pay your bills, we could have done that. Other countries have done that. So that would have been the way I would try and lead and say, this is one way you can put people at ease and say, hey, you can actually adhere to public safety and health guidelines. You can stay home. You don't need to worry about your bills for this period of time. And if you're struggling, then we need to try and get you resources even now. So that's things like the crisis text line, but you have to be realistic. Domestic violence is surging right now. Child abuse is surging right now. So to the extent that we have resources that can help with any of those things, we should just be honest and say, look, we know these things are surging, and to the extent we can help, including at the high end, even trying to intervene in someone's household situation, because some of those situations are going to devolve into very dangerous environments.
Sure. And one program that you have worked on that mirrors the solutions you're talking about is Project 100, which you launched alongside Stacey Abrams. Can you tell us about that program and how it's getting funded?
Project 100 is a philanthropic effort to give $100 million to 100,000 food stamp recipients over the next 100 days. And I'm just thrilled to be a part of it because our government bureaucracies, again, are not meeting everyone's needs. So a set of major philanthropists, the Schusterman Family Foundation, Google, some really fun people like Rihanna and I think Ariana Grande have put some money up, and they're already at the vast majority of this $100 million in 100 days. And being a part of it's privilege because we're improving people's lives. I was just on CNN with Dominique, one of the recipients, and she was a bartender at an airport in Louisiana, which clearly does not operate. She had not received any stimulus because she didn't have a tax return last year. And Project 100 got her $1,000 and got her $1,000 within 2 days of her pushing the button and saying she needed help. Wouldn't that be magic for us all? Imagine if you all had a button you could press and then $1,000 appears 2 days later. We're making that happen for tens of thousands of Americans. But the fact is, it should happen for all of us. This should not be so difficult. And we have the means to put money into people's hands, and Project 100 is demonstrating that that's true.
And I think during your candidacy, some voters had questions about whether funding for UBI would take funding away from programs like SNAP. Is Project 100 partially your way of kind of putting those concerns to bed, that both things can be funded equally?
Well, it's very much on top of SNAP benefits, that's for sure. And I got to say, it's been really fun because if you're a SNAP recipient in one of these areas and then a pop-up comes up and says, "Hey, do you want another $1,000?" They're like, "What?" They look at it, they're like, click on it, and they get it. So yeah, like my goal was always to try and build a floor that works for everyone. And then that doesn't mean we should be reducing support for people in various ways. We should be trying to solve people's problems, particularly in this time where it's like we have to face facts. Like, we're at Great Depression level unemployment. You have tens of millions of Americans who've lost their jobs. There's a lower proportion of Americans working right now than in our nation's history. So this is the time for big solutions and big advancements. We don't have a choice. Like, we need a Marshall Plan scale effort to rebuild this country, and everything needs to be on the table. Like, even things that I didn't think were great ideas. I obviously thought giving people money was a great idea for, since before the crisis. But anything we can do to help get people into positive situations, we should do.
Can you speak to that a little bit more? Can you tell our audience a couple of things that COVID-19 has brought to your attention that could be implemented as solutions?
Well, we're in a crisis. And one of the things I've said to folks is, like, when the house is on fire, you don't worry about the amount of water you're using to put it out. So we've got a $21 trillion fire going on, and you just need to do anything you can to put it out. So some of the things I think we should be doing, I think we should just be like sending money to every nonprofit that's doing pretty much anything under the sun. Because like nonprofits, their support levels are plummeting. All of them canceled their fundraisers. They're cutting people. Do you really want nonprofits like firing their people now of all times? So we should be taking any organization that's doing anything positive and just like put money into their hands so they're not firing people. Same is definitely true of states, hospitals. Like, you have to push on the things you can push. And one of the reasons why I've always been so passionate about universal basic income is it's one of the few things you can actually do very quickly. And we just saw it where Congress just conjured up. Now it's like up to almost like $2.8 trillion and counting because we're in the midst of a crisis. Imagine if we had just made the same kind of decision without a crisis, where we just looked up and said, "Hey, you know what? We should probably like try and get the boot off of your throat. And put some money into your hands," because the money doesn't disappear in our hands anyway. It just goes right back into the economy. It goes to like local businesses and restaurants, and daycare and tutoring services. So one reason why I love it so much is that it's a tool that we know works, that you can use quickly. Now, there are other things that you need to do that are equally important, that are not, unfortunately, as easy as money. So that's around healthcare infrastructure. That's around PPE. That's around vaccines and antibodies and testing. Like, why do we still have no tests available in a lot of these areas? Like in other countries, they've had drive-through testing. I saw a story that really just said it all, where the governor of Maryland managed to get his hands on like hundreds of thousands of COVID tests from South Korea because like he had a relationship. And it's like, that's what we've been reduced to. Like, the governor of Maryland has to try and like do an end around to go to South Korea to, like, the fact that there's like right now a competitive bidding war for PPE is unconscionable. It's like, does that make any sense to anyone, where you have FEMA outbidding states, outbidding each other? And so, who's not getting the vital supplies? Louisiana, Mississippi, places that are poor. And guess what? That's where the public health threat from the coronavirus is highest, because you have low levels of healthcare infrastructure and very high levels of pre-existing conditions.
Absolutely. And you've mentioned the unemployment rate a few times. During your campaign, you talked a lot about joblessness in the face of automation, which has been put on hyperspeed with this pandemic. Yep. What would your solution be to the unemployment rate in this country?
So I just want to make a couple of big points that everyone should bear in mind. Number one is many of these millions of jobs that have been lost are never coming back. And I'm just going to use an example that we can all understand. Macy's furloughed most of their 130,000 employees. How many of those employees do you think Macy's going to bring back over the next 6, 8, months? 100%? Of course not. There are a bunch of stores that were borderline anyway that they were like looking at closing. The big company CEOs are completely investing in automation and software to try and get things done without as many people. I know this in part because they're like telling friends of mine that that's exactly what they're doing. I mean, they're not going to come out and say, being like, hey, I'm going to take advantage of this crisis to like automate my processes. But that is exactly what they are doing. So we have to face facts. This economy is not going to be like a rubber band that snaps into place. Many of these jobs are gone for good. So now you have this nation rebuilding question of like, how the heck do you employ all these people? This is where putting money into our hands comes in. This is where putting money into small businesses, into nonprofits, and into giant public works, into infrastructure, into sustainable development, into a healthcare workforce. We're hundreds of thousands of workers short on people who can even do testing. So we need to hire as many people as we need. And so if you imagine there's like this giant hole, like now it's going to be up to us to fill it. And the government should be doing everything in its power to help other people have the resources they need to hire, but then in some cases actually hire people for tasks that are necessary.
Absolutely. And I want to go to some audience questions. We're getting great questions in, so thank you all for commenting. One audience member asks, what do you think the new normal will look like after the pandemic?
So I try and avoid the new normal in part because so we had, I guess you'd call what happened pre-pandemic as like normal, let's say. And then there's this sense that the pandemic is going to push us one way and then we're going to somehow snap the other way and that will be the new normal. It's like the way a lot of us think. The truth is that there's like tremendous havoc being wreaked on individuals, families, businesses, organizations around the country. And the new normal in the absence of any massive intervention on our part is just less functional, more damaged, less entrepreneurial, less robust. It's just a wreck. Like if you ask me, what do you think the new normal will look like in the absence of massive intervention, the new normal will be like a shambles, frankly. And so the question is, how do you prevent that from being what we are faced with? That is, to me, why you need a massive Marshall Plan scale initiative. And like it or not, the only entity that has the resources necessary to do that kind of work at that scale is the federal government. So when you ask me, what does the new normal look like? It's a wreck, it's a mess, it's a shambles, unless we put literally trillions of dollars to work trying to make it something better.
And do you think the implementation of a VAT tax would still be your recommendation, even moving past the COVID-19 pandemic?
Well, we need to get resources into our hands. And if you have companies hastening automation, which you do have, so let's say I'm a company and I replace thousands of call center workers with software. Now, the call center workers used to pay taxes. The software does not. And you have the biggest, most successful companies of our age, Amazon, Netflix, Starbucks, literally paying zero in corporate taxes right now because the corporate income tax is really easy to game. So the question is, they just move it to Ireland, especially if they're multinational. They say like nothing to see here. So you need a mechanism where we get some of those gains. And my proposal was a value-added tax, which would get those gains. I think that would be a very effective way. That to me is the big challenge, is that you have to recognize how dysfunctional our current corporate tax system is and then change it so that the Amazons of the world are not paying zero in taxes. Think about that. Amazon, $1 trillion company, hiring 100,000 people, zero in taxes, while everyone else heads indoors.
And you mentioned big tech. I want to talk a little bit about user privacy. I've been wondering, if we move into this universal push for tracing the virus, how will that impact user privacy, not only now, but moving past the pandemic?
This is a very big problem and issue where I'm going to just tell a story from my family. Sure. A cousin of mine landed in China a number of weeks ago, and she was then tested at the airport, escorted to her apartment, a monitor was put on her apartment. She was told to stay there for 2 weeks, and then a government employee came every day to check on her, make sure she hadn't gone anywhere, and take her temperature. Now, if you're in America, you hear that, that sounds dystopian. But would that help stem your concern about someone just coming from another environment and then just walking around infecting people? Yeah, probably would. So that is really going to be the kind of trade-off we make, where in China, they actually are going to have you scan QR codes just to go into a public place that relay your data, and you get color coded based upon your level of risk, and then if you're green, you can go in. If you're red, you can't. Now, how the heck do they determine if you're red or green? Based on a lot of data that they've been tracking. And if it turns out that you're infected later, they can figure out who you were around. Contact tracing is a very highly laborious process, really difficult. And if you're going to reopen any part of the economy and you're going to do it, you would need to have some robust tech tracing and tracking tools. And those things run afoul of what most of us regard as our privacy rights, because it's I don't want you to know if I go to the freaking grocery store. Now, there's actually a public health benefit of my knowing if you went to the grocery store, because if it turns out someone else in that grocery store was sick, we can be hey, FYI, So this is the massive trade-off we need to make. And we need to say to people, look, if you want to get out of this crisis faster, we're going to need some information about you. And different Americans are going to have different responses to that. But this is the kind of conversation we need to be having if we're going to actually get this virus under control moving forward, because you have to know that this thing might recur.
And not to make this the Black Mirror section of the interview, but do you envision there being any sort of immune class structure that evolves out of this pandemic?
I think that if we're successful at reopening parts of the economy, we're going to have a much more robust testing infrastructure in place. And so that if you're going someplace and getting tested and you know that you're all right, you're safe, other people are safe, one component of that might be do I have the antibodies if it turns out that if you've had it before that you're resistant, and then can you document that? And so there are going to be people who have either resistance or test clean, or access to tests that will have more liberty than others, to at least in certain environments. So I think that is what I'm just describing would look like progress, honestly, because right now we don't have the tests and we don't have the ability to even give you any kind of documentation that you may be resistant. So that in some ways might actually be a positive step if we got to a point where you could actually show that you're low risk.
So it sounds like you're saying there is a bit of a trade-off, but you would land on the side of potentially giving up some privacy in the name of ending the virus.
I think that is the right approach if we're going to reopen parts of the economy, because you have to be realistic. Right now, we're in the mitigate community spread phase, which is quite extreme. It involves most of us being at home, and we may be at this for 18 months. And so is it realistic to have everyone maximally stay at home for 18 months? It's not. So then if you're going to reopen parts of the economy, then you need data, you need testing. And part of that is us sharing information.
Sure. And Andrew, I want to end by, I know you only have a couple minutes left with us. A lot of our audience has questions, of course, about your political future. I'm wondering, if Joe Biden wins the White House, what cabinet position would you potentially see yourself in?
Well, that's nice of people to be interested in my future. I think Trump's a disaster. I'm very eager to help Joe win the White House, and when Joe wins, if he taps me for a high impact position in his administration, I'd obviously be very open to it. I'm passionate about many issues that I ran on. One's obviously universal basic income, but another one is the impact of technology on our way of life. I think that our government has been decades behind the curve on many technology issues. and that's gone from inconvenient to disastrous over time. And if there's something I can do to help accelerate our government, I would give that sort of role a very, very long look.
And you've also hinted at running for mayor of New York City. If you choose to follow through with that, you'd be inheriting a very different New York after this crisis. What would your plan potentially look like to revitalize the city?
New York is going to have a very, very deep hole to dig out of, and it hurts me because I love New York. And in terms of what we need to do, I mean, again, you have to try and reopen parts of the economy, and to do that, you need tests, you need consumer confidence. So my first order of business would be to try and make sure that if you're going to school, if you're going to a hospital, if you're going to work, that you know that you're going to be safe. And if you can accomplish that, then you can actually look at trying to re-energize parts of the city. But it's going to be a long road back, and it makes me very sad. Like, it's not going to be, again, that's one reason why, like, you talk about the new normal. New York City is going to be one of the hardest hit urban areas from this crisis for a long time to come.
Absolutely. And we've talked a lot about how it is just such a hard and saddening time, but you are so widely known by all of your staffers to be such a joyful and positive person to work
nice.
with.
Wow, that's so nice to hear. Yes, thank you, Madison. It makes me so happy.
Round truth that campaign staffers have said about you. So I'm wondering, how are you keeping that attitude up during quarantine?
Madison, thanks to the people who supported my campaign, I feel like I can help people, and like I'm in a position, we're all suffering in different ways, in the sense that, like, I haven't met my niece, like, my kids aren't going to see their grandparents for months and months on end. But I still count myself very, very lucky, and I need to help. If you have the capacity to help right now, you need to help. And thanks to the folks who've supported me, I feel like I'm in that category. But if you'd like to help, one way to do so is through my organization, movehumanityforward.com. But there are dozens of organizations out there that you can get involved with. Please do step up, come together, help your fellow Americans, because everyone needs it right now. And this crisis is a very, very challenging time, but it's going to show what we're made of. And I hope that we can show that in a very, very positive way.
And Andrew, we have just 1 or 2 minutes left here. I want to ask, how was it for you going from campaigning and being in countless cities to being under quarantine?
One advantage to it is that I've missed my kids a lot, and I've learned a lot about my kids now. They went from having too little dad to maybe a little bit too much. So, so that's been a bright side, that, like, at least I'm getting family time that I've missed out on the last couple of years. I missed my kids a great deal. I have 2 boys who are 4 and 7, one of whom is autistic. And my wife, Evelyn, has just been such a rock star and rock to the family. So being able to spend time with them has been one of the few positives to come out of this time.
And I also just wanted to ask you about homeschooling. I'm wondering if you think enough is being done to help parents who are having to homeschool children of varying neurological abilities during this quarantine.
I just want to shout out every teacher, every daycare worker, every parent, because even if you have your kid plugged into the laptop, I mean, they'll just wander off. It's like, I mean, they're kids. It's like, what are you going to do? So most every parent is juggling different jobs. I think I speak for many, many parents around the country, where we are very eager for schools to reopen because there are a lot of things that kids need that you get through being in class, being in school, being with other people, that you can't get from a laptop. That's just my perspective. I know there are many people who love the distance learning aspect. I think that I'm just more appreciative of my kids' teachers every day.
Absolutely. Well, Andrew, thank you so much for your time, and thank you to our audience for joining and commenting with all your questions. We really appreciate it.
Thank you, Madison. Stay awesome. Stay healthy. See everyone soon.
Thank you so much.